Billionaire visits his mother's grave and meets a boy who reveals an unbelievable secret. Nothing prepared Elijah for what he would see that day. An unknown boy, kneeling before the same tombstone he had visited for years, whispered words that seemed plucked from the past. But one of them made his heart stop for a second. A name that couldn't be there. A name that brought back memories he believed he had left behind. This was no coincidence. It was the echo of something that had been hidden for too long. What seemed like a simple tribute became the beginning of a devastating revelation. A secret buried by a powerful family. Something forcibly silenced. In front of him was the truth they never told. And now, with that boy's eyes fixed on his, Elijah will need to choose between remaining silent or facing everything that has been erased from his history. Stay until the end to discover how this silent encounter in a cemetery exposes the cruelest betrayal and reveals the truth no one dared tell. No one should be there. That's what Elijah thought when he saw the small figure hunched in front of the tombstone. The cemetery remained deserted as always. Only the sound of one's own steps on the wet earth filled the silence of that annual visit. He came every year, always on the same day, at the same time, paying a silent tribute to the only person who had ever judged him for his choices. But that afternoon, something was different. A boy, alone, kneeling before the tomb, whispered low, almost imperceptible words, as if apologizing to someone who could no longer respond. The scene made no sense. No one in the family should know where that woman was buried. Elijah approached slowly, feeling his heart racing without knowing why. The boy looked to be around 10 years old, with dark skin, delicate features, and a lost look. The coat he was wearing was too big. The cuffs fell almost to his fingers. His knees were covered in dirt, and his hands were shaking, as if he didn't know if he was doing something right or dangerous. For a moment, he didn't even notice the man's presence. Elijah stood there watching without understanding, until the boy looked up and murmured something that left him paralyzed. He said he was there because his mother had told him where his grandmother was buried. The information fell with the weight of an unresolved memory. Elijah knew, at that very moment, that this was not a mistake. Something had been hidden, and he needed to understand what was happening before it was too late. Elijah tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't come out. Instead, he knelt beside the boy, observing the name carved into the stone that he already knew by heart. The boy didn't take his eyes off the tombstone, muttering words of regret, as if he was asking for forgiveness for something he didn't fully understand. The billionaire, accustomed to meeting rooms and decisions that moved fortunes, found himself faced with a situation that no spreadsheet could explain. The presence of that boy was not a coincidence. It wasn't a coincidence. Something brought him there, something that came from the past. And what Elijah didn't yet know was that that silent meeting would begin a sequence of revelations that would call his entire story into question. Elijah took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. He said that perhaps the boy was mistaken, that grave belonged to his mother who died many years ago. But the boy shook his head slowly, without getting up, saying that his mother had been clear. That was his grandmother's grave, and he needed to come alone, even without permission. There was something about the innocent firmness of that answer that moved Elijah in a strange way. The confidence with which the boy spoke seemed to carry more than simple guidance. It seemed like a guarded truth, passed on like a secret. Elijah didn't know what to think. A shiver ran up his back, and at that moment, everything around him seemed suspended in the air. When the boy said his mother's name, Elijah took half a step back, as if he had been punched. Yara. That name wasn't just a memory, it was a scar, an ancient story, locked inside him for more than a decade. It wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. Elijah's mind raced to a distant time, to a version of himself that he had tried to erase over the years. He thought about what he felt for Yara, what they lost, what was left unanswered. The throat dried up. The boy looked back at the tombstone and whispered his grandmother's name again. Elijah swallowed. That child was not there by chance. Looking closer, Elijah felt something even more unsettling grow inside his chest. The contour of the boy's face, the line of his jaw, the way he frowned. Those traits were not strange to him. They were echoes of yourself. It was like looking at a fragmented image of one's past. The boy had large, attentive eyes, dark and dense, with the same intensity he recognized in the mirror. For a moment, everything seemed to fall apart into silence. Elijah could no longer look away from that face. The blood flowed faster, and the mind was filled with questions that had no form yet. But deep down, he already knew that the most important answer was right there, in front of him. Elijah crouched down, trying to find a way to connect with the boy. He asked his name and heard a short, almost whispered answer. Malik. The tone was restrained, as if he was saying something that required courage. Gradually, Malik revealed that his mother never liked to talk about his father. Whenever he asked, she would change the subject or just say that he didn't want anything to do with them, that he had moved on with his life, too busy to remember a past that no longer interested him. This stuck in Malik's head for years. Elijah felt the impact of those words. There was no accusation in the boy's voice, just a quiet acceptance that hurt more than any outright reproof. Without thinking much, Elijah offered to take the boy home. Malik hesitated for a moment but ended up accepting. Along the way, Elijah was silent, processing what he had just discovered. The streets began to change profile until they completely moved away from the sophisticated image of the city he knew. The building where Malik lived was old, with narrow stairs and paint peeling around the edges. When they arrived, the boy pointed to the door and said that his mother would probably already be home. Elijah nodded, his heart beating fast and unevenly. That door represented much more than a reunion. It was a chance to face what was ripped away from him years ago, without him knowing. Yara opened the door and froze in the doorway, eyes wide, breath suspended. For a few seconds, neither of them said anything. The silence carried years of hurt. She watched him suspiciously, as if he were a shadow from the past that refused to disappear. Yara's face was no longer the same as when she was younger, but she still had the strength of someone who held the world in her hands alone. With a firm voice, she said she didn't need anything from him, that Elijah had made his choice, turning his back on her and their son. He tried to argue, to say he didn't know, but she interrupted. She said that all those years she raised Malik alone, while he built an empire and forgot they existed. Elijah listened silently, unable to defend a story that not even he knew in full. Elijah held tight to the doorframe, trying not to give in to the confusion that was boiling inside him. He needed to understand. He wanted to know why he never knew she was pregnant. The question came out filled with a mixture of anger and fear, but Yara didn't respond harshly. She took a deep breath, leaned her back against the wall, and said that at the beginning of the pregnancy, she felt ill and was rushed to the hospital. She said she tried to contact Elijah, but he was out of the country on work. So, believing that he would be informed, she called his family's house and left a message with the maid, explaining what had happened. She thought it would be a matter of hours before he showed up or called back. She waited days, then weeks, but nothing happened. The wait turned to silence, and the silence, little by little, turned into giving up. Sometime after discharge, with her belly already showing, Yara decided to look for him in person. She took a bus to the address where Elijah lived with his parents, but when she got there, she found the gates closed, the house empty, and a real estate sign hanging on the wall. A neighbor, curious about her insistence on the intercom, explained that the family had recently moved without leaving any clues. She said she heard they had gone to another country, perhaps because of family business. Yara returned home without understanding anything. She spent weeks trying to call, sent letters to the company's old address, and looked for people she knew, but no one knew anything. She was swallowed by a silence that had no justification, as if they had simply erased her existence from Elijah's life, and over time she accepted that she was alone in that story. As Yara spoke, Elijah felt his body lose balance inside. Her words clicked together like pieces of an ancient puzzle that finally began to fit together. He recalled that that same year his family made drastic decisions, including the sudden transfer of the company's headquarters abroad. At the time, Elijah just followed what his parents determined. He was obsessed with proving that he was worthy of his family's trust and the name he carried. He was removed from Paris overnight, placed in charge of a new branch as a symbol of trust, but now he saw clearly that everything was part of something bigger. It was more than control. It was sabotage. The separation had not been his choice. It had been an imposition carefully planned. Little by little, the truth hurt more than any lie. Elijah realized that at that moment, the past was returning with force to exact the price for everything that was hidden. The shock was so great that he could barely organize his thoughts. The woman he loved believed for years that he had abandoned everything out of convenience, and his son grew up being told he wasn't wanted. The hardest part was knowing that all of this happened without him having the slightest chance to stop it. Elijah needed answers, and deep down, he knew that he still didn't know everything. Something told him that the family's decision wasn't just out of pride. There were larger interests involved, and he was determined to discover what else had been buried along with that part of his life. If this story is moving you so far, check if you are already subscribed to the channel. The next stories will also move you deeply. Elijah left Yara's house with his thoughts confused. The sky seemed heavier, but it wasn't the weather that bothered him. It was the feeling of having lived under a very well-constructed lie. The long steps along the sidewalk did not follow a clear destination. He needed to breathe. He needed to assimilate what he had just heard. Yara's words echoed like hammers. Everything had been very well calculated, very well articulated, and somehow, he had accepted this script without asking questions. There was a part of himself that still tried to justify what he didn't know, but now he was no longer willing to accept ready-made versions. That story hid more than just disagreements, and deep down, Elijah knew the answers were hidden where it all began. In the past, he abandoned to build his empire. The next morning, he arrived at the main office before everyone else. The team was still sleeping while he was already searching the confidential documents wing of the family foundation's old headquarters. The access key still worked, although that sector had fallen into disuse with the digitization of almost everything. But Elijah knew that the oldest traces were precisely in the forgotten papers: physical files, correspondence, internal diaries, and board memos. It was all impersonal, meticulous, and full of records that only those who lived behind the scenes at that time knew how to decipher. He spent hours between folders, not knowing exactly what he was looking for, but he felt that at some point he would stumble upon the truth. He didn't want rumors. He wanted proof. He wanted what he never had: a concrete explanation. His hands were already stained with dust when an unlabeled folder at the bottom of a separate drawer caught his attention. It was thin, discreet, but held heavy documents. When he opened it, he saw medical reports, letters written by lawyers, and a sequence of memos with handwritten notes. Yara's name appeared there, repeated on pages with dates close to the change of headquarters. There were mentions of her hospitalization, diagnoses, and recommendations on how to deal with the situation, but not in a human way. Everything was treated as a reputational risk. There was no empathy, just cold, direct instructions. The notes talked about preserving the family's image, ensuring business stability, and preventing any scandal. The term muffle appeared more than once. Elijah felt his stomach drop. Turning over one of the sheets, he found confirmation that Yara's connection had been registered. The message was received, processed, and forwarded to the family's lawyers. There was the name of the person responsible for responding on Elijah's behalf, signing a document that communicated that he did not want to maintain any ties with the young woman. A false text, with a forged signature. Elijah recognized it immediately. The adoptive father's handwriting appeared in marginal comments on the documents, approving the action with strategic justifications. It was a deliberate decision. They knew about the pregnancy. They knew about the hospitalization, and they still acted to get rid of everything. Elijah stood still for a while, the papers shaking in his hands. He was faced with the truth that was never given to him. But now that it had been revealed, he could no longer pretend that nothing had happened. As he reread the pages, Elijah fixed his eyes on his adoptive father's notes. Every sentence written there left no doubt. This hadn't just been a miscommunication or a casual glitch. It was a planned, cold, and strategic operation. Yara's name was cited as a direct risk to the family's image, classified as a threat to the continuity of the legacy they cared for so much. Elijah knew his stepfather was obsessed with reputation and control, but he didn't imagine he would be able to intervene to that degree. He remembered veiled conversations at the time, disguised advice, invitations to look ahead. Now he understood the real meaning of those words. Everything had been designed to keep him away from the only woman he truly loved and a son he never even had the chance to meet. The plan was clear: silence the truth, not only to avoid scandals, but to mold Elijah to the standard that the family believed to be ideal. The correspondence between the lawyers made this clear. The memos ordered that any call or letter received from Yara be intercepted, archived, and discarded. Her name was not to be mentioned in meetings or circulated in the hallways. No employee should comment on the matter. The instruction was to treat everything as a deviation from the route that needed to be corrected in silence, and to do so, they manipulated Elijah's perception, erasing clues, and providing carefully filtered information. The headquarters was transferred, he was promoted, sent far away, distracted by goals and strategies. Meanwhile, Yara carried a pregnancy alone, being pushed into oblivion. Revolt took the place of surprise. Elijah felt his chest tighten. For years, he thought he had done the right thing. He worked tirelessly to honor the family name, to keep the empire standing. And now he realized that this entire effort was built on lies. Those who were supposed to guide him had shaped his path like someone carving a piece of marble. Cold, precise, without room for doubt. They decided what he should know, who he should love, who he should marry. And what hurt most was understanding that even with everything he achieved, he never truly had control. The guilt was heavy. The absence, the distance, the lost years, All of that was the result of a story manipulated from the ground up. It wasn't just injustice, it was treason. With the papers still in hand, Elijah leaned back against the bookshelf and closed his eyes for a few seconds. The mind was spinning in circles. Malik believed his father never wanted him. Yara faced everything alone, believing she had been discarded. And him? He lived a life shaped by others, believing he was the author of his own decisions. Now that the truth had emerged, he knew he could not go back. But he also couldn't keep pretending that nothing had changed. The pain was great, but even greater was the need to repair, at least a part. But how? The damage seemed too deep. And amidst that silence of old files and forgotten shelves, Elijah understood that the hardest part was yet to come. The streets seemed longer when Elijah returned to the neighborhood where Yara lived. The car moved slowly, not because of the traffic, but because of the uncertainty that gripped him. On the bench next to him rested the folder with the documents that confirmed everything that had been hidden for years. The paper had weight, not because of the grammar, but because of the story it carried. Arriving at the building, he climbed the stairs without waiting for the elevator, as if the urgency that burned inside needed movement. In front of the door, he hesitated for a second. Then he took a deep breath and knocked. When Yara opened it, her eyes narrowed when she saw him there again. Before she said anything, he just held out the folder, his voice low, almost choked. He said she needed to see that. Yara took a few seconds to pick up the papers. The silence between the two was thick. They sat at the kitchen table, and as she leafed through the pages, her gaze changed. Fingers trembled slightly with each new paragraph read. Her name appeared on sheets she never saw. Medical reports detailing his hospitalization, intercepted letters, forged documents with Elijah's signature, and the family patriarch's handwriting scrawled in the margins with cold guidance. There was no room for doubt. The distance, the silence, Elijah's sudden disappearance, everything had been planned, and she, all those years, believed that he simply chose to leave. When he finished reading, his eyes were teary, but there was no scream, no scene, just an old tiredness that now found a name and form. Have you ever been in a situation where something important in your life was hidden from you? Or do you know someone who experienced this? Leave it here in the comments. I want to know your story too. Elijah didn't try to justify himself. Sitting on the other side of the table, he watched Yara in silence. There was no possible defense. He just said he never knew anything. Who trusted his parents and their decisions too much, thinking they were a natural part of the path he needed to follow. He said that he only now realized how much he was being manipulated. His voice wavered between firmness and pain, and his face, so confident in other situations, now displayed a dismay that he had never let anyone see. Yara finally looked up at him. There was a knot stuck in her chest, something between relief and revolt. It was good to know it hadn't been discarded, but the hurt of the years in silence, of the nights raising Malik alone, of the unanswered questions, none of that disappeared with the truth. The environment was suspended for a while, as if everything around had stopped just to let that moment exist. The truths came to light, but they did not erase the path taken. Malik was still sleeping in the next room, not knowing what was happening. Yara ran her hand through the papers once more, then slowly stacked them and pushed them back toward Elijah. He said he needed time. He didn't know what to do with all that. What he felt for him was still a confusing mixture of longing and an open wound. Elijah nodded. He didn't insist. He just thanked her for reading it. But as he walked out the door, a question rattled around in his head. Could he still fix something? Or was this just the beginning of another loss? Yara didn't immediately say yes to Elijah's approach, but she also didn't close the door completely. She told him that he could try to get closer, but that it would have to be done calmly without forcing anything, without creating unrealistic expectations. Trust, according to her, was something that was not asked for now, but was built, brick by brick. And it wasn't just between them. It was Malik who most needed to feel safe, and that would take time. Elijah listened to everything with his head down and his fists clasped. He wasn't there to demand anything. He didn't want shortcuts. What he wanted most at that moment was just a chance, however small, to be present. He promised that he would respect the limits, that he would be patient, even though he didn't know where to start. He left without guarantees, but with silent permission to try. In the days that followed, Elijah carefully kept in touch. He avoided exaggerations, didn't call out of turn, and never showed up unannounced. Over time, Yara began to let him participate in small moments. Sometimes she let him pick up Malik from school. Other times they met in a park or discreet cafe, where the atmosphere was less pressured. Elijah also suggested a trip to the science museum, where Malik showed a timid interest in dinosaurs and fossils. The walk was peaceful without much dialogue, but Elijah remained present, listening, observing, respecting the silences. It offered space, without invading. He felt that, even if almost invisibly, something was beginning to change in the boy's eyes. It wasn't affection yet, but it felt like a crack being opened with effort. Malik didn't ask direct questions, but his reactions made it clear he was paying attention. He observed everything, like someone testing the stability of new ground. The smiles were still scarce, and when they came, they were short-lived. The words came out measured, as if each one needed to be evaluated before reaching the mouth. Elijah understood. He was also learning. He discovered that it was better to accept the boy's pace than to try to rush the connection. When the boy showed interest in something, like building toys or science books, Elijah listened attentively. He didn't respond with exaggerated enthusiasm. He just went with the flow, as if they were dancing to a song he didn't yet know well. That was Malik's language, precise, reserved, and often clearer in silence than in spoken sentences. One late afternoon, as they walked back to the car after another short walk, Malik held Elijah's coat sleeve for a second. He didn't say anything, just made him stop for a moment and pointed to an aquarium store in the middle of the street. Elijah followed the gesture with his eyes, then looked at the boy, who was already letting go of his sleeve and walking forward as if nothing had happened. This wasn't just curiosity. It was a test, a subtle sign of openness. Elijah felt his heart beat faster, not because of the store or the colorful fish behind the glass, but because of the silent breach Malik had just offered. It was the first real gesture of trust, even if it was disguised. And at that moment, he knew he needed to keep going. But what came next could still surprise them in ways neither of them imagined. At the exit of the store, as they walked side by side along a narrow sidewalk, Malik unexpectedly broke the silence. The voice came out low, bluntly, with the simplicity of someone carrying a question for too long. He asked why Elijah never came to him. No accusations, no tone of outrage, just raw doubt. Elijah stopped. The boy's words hit him hard, not because of the tone, but because of its absence. It was that weightless honesty that made him hurt even more. For years, Malik lived with the idea that he was ignored, and now he was there, making room for a response. Elijah took a deep breath. He knew he couldn't respond with ready-made sentences. It was no longer about protecting one's own image, but about recovering something that perhaps had never really existed. He looked into the boy's eyes and told the truth, that he never knew about the pregnancy, that no one had told him, that everything he could have done was sabotaged before he even had the chance. He said that he trusted the wrong people, that he lived for years thinking that he had ended a painful phase of his youth, when in fact he was being kept away from what really mattered. His voice shook slightly, but he didn't back down. He didn't defend himself. He didn't try to clear his name. He just explained. He apologized for the time wasted, for the silence he never chose, for the absence that now consumed him. Malik listened silently, his eyes downcast, and his shoulders tense. He didn't respond immediately. He just kept walking, his hands in his pockets, his steps too slow for his age. On the way back, the boy didn't bring up the subject again, but something had changed. Small gestures began to appear more naturally. Malik no longer flinched at the slightest touch. He allowed Elijah to follow him more closely, without that watchful eye all the time. He didn't smile broadly, nor did he run to hug the man he now discovered was his father, but the weight in the air seemed lighter. That type of protection that had been erected around him was beginning to show small cracks. Elijah noticed the changes in details. A loose comment, a longer answer, a joke that didn't exist before. He knew it wasn't affection yet, but he understood it was a path, and if there was anything he had learned in recent times, it was the importance of not rushing things at the right time. Even with this small advance, the shadow of the past still haunted Elijah's thoughts. He knew that rebuilding such a delicate relationship would not come without obstacles, and that progress would not always be visible. But that gesture from the boy, that question asked so sincerely, had been an opening, the first sign that Malik wanted to understand, and perhaps in the near future, he would also want to forgive. Elijah was not deluded by fantasies. He knew that deep wounds cannot be healed with beautiful words. But now that the boy was starting to accept him around, a new fear was looming on the horizon, something he had been trying to ignore, but soon he couldn't avoid it anymore. The days went on with a certain disguised harmony. Malik began to show small signs of approaching. Elijah was present without forcing spaces, and Yara maintained the routine as best she could. However, there was something in her eyes that betrayed tiredness. The headaches came more frequently. First, she attributed it to stress. Then, sleepless nights. But episodes of dizziness began to recur with worrying intensity, until one ordinary night, While he was collecting some books scattered around the living room, he lost his balance and fell to his knees, trying to support himself on the sofa. His breathing became short, and before he could call for help, everything went black. Malik found her lying minutes later, still unconscious. The scare shook the house like a silent storm, and within hours, she was in the hospital. The exams were quick, the doctors were direct. An advanced and aggressive brain tumor. The possibility of surgery was remote, and even with treatment, the following months would be of intense physical exhaustion. The life expectancy was no more than half a dozen months. The news came like a punch without warning. Yara heard everything with her fists closed and her gaze fixed on the ground. Her head was spinning, not because of the dizziness, but because of the avalanche of thoughts that came with the diagnosis. The doctor spoke about palliative alternatives, attempts at control, and then remained silent, respecting the patient's silence. On the way home, Yara looked out the window without seeing anything. Malik slept in the back seat, exhausted from crying, and all she could think about was the time she wouldn't have. The next day, still with her voice choked and her body tired, Yara called Elijah. She asked him to come to her house without explaining why. When he arrived, he found her sitting at the table, her eyes sunken and her face paler than he remembered. She was direct without beating around the bush. She talked about the diagnosis, about the cruel urgency that now marked her days, and finally, she talked about Malik. She said she needed someone who would not just take him in, but who actually cared about him, someone who knew his quirks, his silences, and his restrained way of asking for affection. With her eyes fixed on Elijah, she asked that he not just be a temporary presence. She wanted him to be a real father, not to leave the boy alone again. It was a request, but it sounded like a last demand from someone who could no longer wait. Elijah remained silent for a few seconds, not because of a lack of response, but because of the avalanche of feelings that mixed in his chest. Fear, guilt, sadness, and above all, the awareness that everything he thought he controlled was falling apart. He accepted the request without hesitation. He promised that he would do everything in his power, but inside him the anguish of knowing that time was too short to correct so many things grew. When he left the house that night, the air felt heavier. The sky was clear, but the whole world seemed to be falling apart. And as he walked down the stairs, he realized that nothing prepared him for what was to come. The only certainty was that he could not fail again. Elijah left Yara's house with his chest tight. The promise he had made was not a phrase of comfort nor a last-minute noble gesture. It was a definitive mission. Taking care of that boy meant much more than just offering shelter and food. It meant being the support he never had. It meant being present in the silences, in the doubts, in the moments when his mother's absence would become unbearable. Elijah knew he couldn't just fill the space left by Yara, but he needed to create a new one, a space that Malik could inhabit without fear, without the weight of distrust or abandonment. It hit him like a silent legacy, something that could not be refused without betraying his own conscience. He carried a lot of guilt, but he wouldn't allow the boy to carry the same pain. Days later, Yara called Elijah to the hospital. The marks of the treatment were already visible on her face, but her gaze remained firm. Without many words, she handed him a notebook with a dark cover, simple on the outside but heavy in his hands. She said she had been writing there for months in the intervals between pain and nausea, during the early mornings when she couldn't sleep. It was a kind of effective map, a long letter divided into fragments. It contained advice for when Malik got sick, childhood stories she wanted him to remember, silly jokes she used to tell on the way to school, and even recipes for things the two of them made together in the kitchen. Elijah opened one of the pages in the middle and read the first sentence. The handwriting was shaky but firm. He felt a lump in his throat and quickly closed the notebook. He knew he still didn't have the structure to face all of that. As the disease progressed, the household routine changed completely. Malik didn't ask as much anymore. He seemed to realize that the answers would be too difficult. The days began to revolve around the hospital, visiting times, medical recommendations, and breaks to prevent the boy from seeing the worst part. With each new visit, Yara was a little weaker. At first, she still smiled and made jokes with Malik. Afterwards, she started talking less and just shaking his hand. And then came the days when she just blinked slowly. Elijah kept his eyes on her the whole time, trying to memorize everything he could still see. Malik, in silence, watched every movement, trying to keep the rhythm of his mother's gestures a secret. Little by little, he realized that his time with her was slipping away, not in words, but in the way she looked at him. On the way home, the silence between the two stretched throughout the car. Malik hugged the notebook to his chest without even opening it. Elijah just drove, with his hands firmly on the steering wheel and his thoughts wandering. He knew that the boy was trying to understand what was happening, without having the tools to process everything. He also knew that at some point, The question would come, a tougher question than any other, and when it came, he would need to be ready. But it wasn't time yet, at least not that day. The way home seemed longer, and even the clear sky brought an inconvenience that was difficult to explain. They crossed the room door in silence. The sound of the doorknob turning was the only noise that broke the void, and in the air, there was the feeling that something definitive was about to happen. The days that followed demanded more from Elijah than any million-dollar negotiation had ever asked of him. For the first time, he needed to learn things that were too simple for his corporate universe, but immense in Malik's universe. He woke up early to prepare breakfast even without knowing exactly what the boy was eating. He sorted clothes, packed his backpack, prepared meals that didn't always turn out well, but that received the silent approval of those who were already too tired to criticize. Schoolwork piled up and he tried to help, even if he stumbled during his exercises. But the hardest part wasn't the daily routine. It was Malik's dull gaze. It was the anger he couldn't verbalize. There was silence at the table, the plate being moved with the fork in the absence of any questions. Elijah saw that boy moving away inside, and even there, it seemed like he was losing him a little more every day. The school started calling frequently, reports of fights on the playground, undelivered work, empty notebooks. Malik, previously curious and full of questions, now just occupied the spaces. He didn't pay attention in class, he avoided his classmates. He responded harshly when asked. When Elijah picked him up at the end of the day, the boy would get into the car without saying a word. At night, he stayed in his room with the lights off. He no longer touched his toys, he didn't open the books he used to read with his mother. He didn't care about company. It was as if the world had become a gray and meaningless place. Elijah tried to talk, but he felt like everything he said was slipping away like the wind. He was beginning to understand that loving a child was also facing what you couldn't name, and that the fear of losing was not enough to guarantee real presence. Not knowing what else to do, Elijah sought help. It wasn't easy to admit that he needed someone to guide a process that he himself didn't understand, but he recognized that he couldn't handle it alone. He found a child therapist who practiced at a small clinic in the neighborhood. It was a cozy place with toys scattered across the floor and walls painted in soft colors. Malik didn't like the idea at first. On the first day, he was silent throughout the session. He just observed the floor, his feet, his fingers. But Elijah didn't give up. He took the boy every week, respecting the schedules and breaks. Little by little, the therapist gained small nods, quick glances, loose sentences that left clues of a feeling about to explode. Elijah watched from a distance between hope and fear, trying to understand how to be a father in moments when his son seemed to not want to be anyone's son. Even with the slow advances, the hole inside Malik was still deep, and Elijah knew that nothing he did would erase the absence of his mother who fell ill day after day. The sessions began to reveal small signs of opening, comments about the past, memories with Yara, even hesitant mentions of Elijah himself. But difficult questions also came, about what would happen when she was no longer there, about who he would be without her. Elijah left some sessions with his chest in pieces, feeling that he was carrying a role that was too heavy for a man who still felt lost. But among the doubts, there was something new emerging, a real desire to make it work. The bond was not formed, but was built from vulnerability. And although nothing was yet resolved, a decisive step was approaching, ready to change everything once again. Malik spent weeks in silence, isolated in his own world. He walked around the house as if it were just a shelter from the wind, not a home. He answered questions with almost imperceptible murmurs, avoided Elijah's gaze, and always kept his shoulders tense. The food on the plate was pushed from one side to the other. The books remained closed on the table. The toys no longer made sense. It seemed like everything that was once part of life had lost its luster. Elijah tried to get closer with small gestures, an invitation to watch something together, a discreet joke, a silly question about dinosaurs. But Malik would not give in. There was a wall between them, built in pain and held up by fear, and Elijah, despite all his efforts, still hadn't found the key to breaking down that invisible barrier that separated him from the father he was trying to learn to be. The night that everything changed came filled with rain and silence. The house was dark, except for the dim light coming from the hallway. Elijah was sitting on the edge of the sofa with a hot mug in his hands, trying to organize thoughts that insisted on getting confused. Malik appeared without making a sound. The bare feet, the wrinkled pajamas, the sunken eyes of someone who hadn't slept properly for days. He hesitantly sat down next to his father and kept his gaze fixed on the floor. For a while he said nothing. The sound of rain hitting the windows filled the room as if it wanted to protect that moment. Then, without warning, Malik blurted out the question that went through Elijah like a blade. He wanted to know if his mother would forget him when she was gone, if she would still think about him after she died. The voice was low, but the weight of the words crushed the air in the room. Elijah took a while to respond, not because of a lack of response, but because he was struggling to maintain control of his own breathing. The question was simple in form, but it carried all the insecurity of a boy who saw the world crumbling before his eyes. He slowly turned around, pulled Malik closer, and hugged him tightly. The boy didn't resist. He didn't hug back, but he didn't pull away either. Elijah said that there was no time or distance capable of erasing Yara's love, that she had left everything possible to make sure he knew this, that her love was in the notebook, in the memories, in the sound of the laughter he still carried in his ears. He said that she loved him so much that she thought about him even between the lines of silence. And that kind of love doesn't disappear. Never. Malik didn't respond. He stood there, curled up in the hug, his forehead resting on Elijah's shoulder. The tears came slowly, almost without sound, running down his face until they disappeared into the fabric of his shirt. It was the first time the boy had cried since his diagnosis. The first time he let someone see him disassembled. Elijah just remained there, without rushing, without saying anything else. He knew that moment didn't ask for explanations, just presence. This time, Malik didn't seem to run away, and even though nothing was resolved, something had changed. The bond that seemed impossible was beginning to form, delicate and uncertain but real, and in that silent embrace, under the continuous sound of rain, father and son met. That night became a turning point for both of them. After the restrained tears and words that had never been spoken, Malik allowed Elijah to hug him without resistance. They stayed like that for long minutes. The boy, exhausted from keeping his pain hidden, finally let go of everything that was suffocating him. Elijah, holding his son tightly, understood that that crying was more than sadness. It was a request for care, a silent response to all attempts to get closer that had previously been refused. When Malik called him father for the first time, it was without ceremony, in a low, choked sentence. And even though the tone was shy, it tore something inside Elijah. It was the beginning of a new space being created between them, a space that pain had opened, but that was beginning to be filled with presence and affection. The next morning, the two slept little. They went to the hospital before sunrise. Malik carried his mother's notebook clutched to his chest. Elijah didn't need to say anything. He just walked beside him in silence as they crossed the hospital corridors. In the bedroom, Yara was too weak to speak. Her eyes were half open, and her body was breathing in spaced pauses. Malik approached her slowly and placed his hand on hers, without saying a word. Elijah pulled up a chair and sat on the other side, taking her other hand between his fingers. The room remained silent. There was no need for promises or explanations, just that mutual presence. Malik, his eyes heavy with fatigue, fell asleep leaning against an armchair next to the bed, the notebook still held in his arms. If this story is touching you, take advantage of this moment and enjoy the video. This helps a lot so that more people receive stories like this. It's just one click, but it makes all the difference. Thanks. Time inside that room seemed to have stopped. The sound of the machines, the distant hum of the hospital, and Yara's slow breathing mixed with the thoughts that flooded Elijah's head. He looked at her face and tried to keep every line, every curve, as if he could carry her with him forever. The first light of day filtered through the curtains. Yara then let out one last breath, calm and almost imperceptible. Elijah didn't move his fingers. He continued to hold her hand, even as he realized the heat was already beginning to escape. He stayed there for a long time, until a nurse discreetly entered and stopped when she saw the scene. With a slight gesture she left, respecting that silent goodbye. There were no tears yet, just a strange emptiness that filled everything. Pain filled the room, but it was a different pain. It was a kind of sadness that was accompanied by gratitude. Elijah looked at Malik, who was still sleeping soundly. He knew that when he woke up, everything would change. But for now, he let the boy rest in peace. That time, even short, had been a gift. They hadn't lived a whole life together, but they had enough for their love to be recognized, and that was already more than Elijah believed possible. Still holding Yara's hand, he closed his eyes for a moment. There were promises that no longer needed to be said, just kept. And in that silence between the end of one story and the beginning of another, father and son were about to discover that the love she left would guide them both for a long time to come. The morning after the funeral, still heavy-eyed and exhausted, Elijah faced the inevitable barrage of unsolicited opinions. Polite but empty suggestions came from all sides. Yara's distant relatives offered to take Malik in, arguing that he needed a more stable environment. One of the school's counselors quietly suggested that a prestigious boarding school would be the ideal environment to deal with grief with adequate support. But none of this made sense to Elijah. He was not willing to delegate the care of his son to anyone else. They had already taken 10 years from him and the chance to know him from the beginning. Now, with everything he had left, he wanted to be there. It didn't matter how difficult it was. The decision was not said out loud in the form of a speech. It was communicated in the gesture of opening the car door and placing Malik's suitcase in the back seat. They returned together, to the same house in silence. The first few days were marked by an emptiness that seemed to reverberate off the walls. Elijah's house, once meticulously organized, now seemed uncomfortable even to him. Malik wandered through the rooms, as if he were passing through. The room was prepared with care, but the boxes were closed, the books were stacked, the clothes were folded as if they were still waiting for some invisible permission to occupy that space. Meals were silent. Malik picked at his food dejectedly and barely answered the simplest questions. Elijah did his best to keep the routine going, but there was something broken between the two, something that couldn't be fixed with immediate effort. The clock seemed slower and the nights longer, especially when Malik took a while to sleep and Elijah heard the small footsteps around the house in the middle of the night. Without experience, Elijah tried to follow what instinct told him. It started with small gestures. He would prepare breakfast even if Malik didn't eat it all. He took the boy to school, even when he got out of the car without looking back. He bought a new lamp for his room, chose a soft blanket, left his mother's notebook on the dresser without saying anything. At night, when Malik locked himself in his room and didn't even come out for dinner, Elijah would leave his plate at the door and sit on the couch, waiting. He knew that forcing anything would break what little they were trying to build, and even though he wasn't sure if he was doing it right, he didn't back down. It was their gift, trying to occupy a space that until recently he didn't even know existed, and that, little by little, started to make a difference. There were no clear signs of progress in the first few days, just nuances, an emptier plate, a shy wave at the school door, a longer look before entering the room. Elijah noticed these details and kept them like someone collecting clues to something precious. It was difficult. The morning was still thick. Yara's absence filled every corner, but there was a bond there starting to take shape. He knew he couldn't rush anything, just continue. And between one gesture and another, something else was preparing to emerge. The moment when Malik would stop just existing in that house and start actually inhabiting it was approaching, and with it, the silent promise that maybe, one day, it would stop hurting the way it did. As the weeks passed, the house changed appearance almost without Elijah noticing. Little by little, the suits that used to occupy the closet alone gave way to children's t-shirts and sneakers scattered across the floor. Finance books were mixed with illustrated stories and magazines about paleontology. The once spotless room now had a blanket thrown on the sofa and a basket of toys in the corner. In the kitchen, new smells began to invade the air. Simple recipes, souvenirs of Yara's favorite dishes that Elijah tried to reproduce with more goodwill than technique. The house stopped being a showcase setting and started to reflect something more intimate, less sterile, more alive. And within that space still marked by absence, a new type of presence took shape. Malik, without even realizing it, started to get caught up in small routines. Choosing dessert after dinner became one of his favorite moments of the day. A simple pot of pudding or a banana with chocolate were treated as serious choices. In the morning, he helped organize the backpack, checked the books, and decided which snack to bring. During the journey to school, he sat in the front seat and listened in silence to the songs that Elijah played on bass. Sometimes he would comment on something, ask the name of the band, or just look out the window with calmer eyes. They were small gestures, but they spoke volumes. Each of them represented a thread being sewn into what could one day become a feeling of security. Elijah understood that it was not about grand declarations, but about constancy. Still, not every day brought progress. There were times when Malik would break down without warning. He would scream in the middle of a simple conversation or cry when he found an old photo in his mother's notebook. Other days, he simply refused to get out of bed. He was curled up staring at the ceiling, not answering calls or accepting breakfast. Elijah learned not to try to solve everything. In the beginning, he was looking for words, arguments, distractions, but he soon understood that there were pains that could not be fixed with logic. Instead, he sat beside the boy in silence, left one hand on the blanket, offered time. Being there was all he could do, and that was what started to make a difference. Malik needed to know he wouldn't be left, not even on the worst days. There was a day when, after one of these episodes of anger, Malik left a note on the table with crooked handwriting. He just said he missed her. Elijah put the paper in a drawer and didn't comment. But that night, when serving dinner, he placed Malik's favorite dessert on the table without asking. The boy didn't smile or thank him, but he ate everything, in silence, and went to bed early. That's how their relationship went, with comings and goings, but also with a discreet firmness that was beginning to take root. The time still hurt. The longing was insistent, However, beneath the cracks left by Yara's absence, father and son were building something new, something that still bore her name in many corners of the house but now also carried signs of a possible home. Time passed with the lightness of someone who does not ask for permission to heal. A year later, Elijah's house no longer carried the weight of absolute silence. There were still difficult days, of course, but the cold that dominated the corridors had dissipated. Yara's portraits were still there, but now they shared space with colorful drawings, souvenirs from trips, and small objects that Malik insisted on leaving scattered around. The living room table, previously used only for meetings or work documents, now housed Lego pieces, adventure books, and the remains of schoolwork with paint stains. The kitchen smelled like cake on the weekends, and the couch, although stained with ice cream and chips, was more comfortable than ever. The house stopped being a place where two strangers tried to survive their grief and gradually became the portrait of a family. One afternoon, while organizing some boxes with what was left of Yara's belongings, Elijah found the hardcover notebook she had given him in the last few days. It was an object that he consulted from time to time, with almost religious respect, but that afternoon he decided to reread it from the beginning. Among routine advice and notes, a page was folded, hidden among others. When he unfolded it, he found a message written in a firmer handwriting than on the last few pages. Yara had left words there that he had never seen. She said she knew he would try even though she didn't know how, that he trusted that, and in the end, she called him father. Elijah stood still for a long time with his hand on the paper, trying to hold back the breath that threatened to collapse along with everything he felt. It was as if in that last line, Yara had given him permission to continue, not just as someone who stayed, but as someone who mattered. A few days later, he and Malik headed to the cemetery together. There was no speech, no dramatization. Elijah carried a bouquet of wildflowers. Malik held a carefully folded envelope, gripped between his fingers more firmly than usual. When they reached the tomb, the boy knelt down, took a deep breath, and placed the letter on the stone. There were drawings on the edges, some crooked letters and words that trembled on the paper. But there was love there, a love that asked for no explanation or justification. Elijah stood beside him, silently observing the gesture. Malik crouched carefully in front of the tombstone, straightened the folded letter, and placed a small stone on top to prevent the wind from blowing it away. The gesture was simple, but it carried an invisible weight, the kind you only understand after losing someone who was everything. He slowly stood up, wiped his pants with his hands, and looked at Elijah, hoping for some sort of approval. The doubt in the boy's eyes was almost shy. Elijah just nodded firmly without hesitation, saying it was perfect, and it was. On that piece of paper, between shaky words and crooked drawings, there was more truth than many adults could say. There, Malik didn't just leave a tribute. He also left the beginning of a new story, a story that would now be shared with his father. Then he ran his hand over Yara's name on the tombstone and closed his eyes for a few seconds. None of them said anything. They didn't need to. Each other's presence was enough to fill everything that previously only fit into the void. On the way home, Malik asked to sit in the front seat. Elijah turned on the radio, letting the songs fill their way back. The boy hummed softly, distracted, while the wind came through the half-open window. Elijah kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting on his knee, where Malik discreetly rested his fingers. It was a small gesture, but full of meaning. The past could not be redone. The losses would not stop hurting. But now there was room for something new, and even if no words were spoken at that moment, the promise was sealed. They would go together, not because life brought them together too late, but because there was still time. Enough time to love, care, and honor everything Yara had left. And that, in itself, was the beginning of everything. And now tell me, have you ever experienced a reunion like this, even if symbolic, with someone who marked your life? Leave it in the comments. I really want to know your answer. Elijah then suggested they stop at the park. It was a longer route, but he needed to give his son a breather after the visit. Malik didn't complain. When they saw the ice cream cart, the boy's eyes lit up with an almost forgotten enthusiasm. He spent long minutes analyzing the flavors, comparing toppings, and trying to decide between two options that looked the same. Elijah stood there, just watching. That childish indecision, that lightness, was everything he didn't know he was waiting for. Malik finally chose chocolate chip cookies and asked for colorful sprinkles on top. When he took the first bite and let out a smile, Elijah felt his chest lighten in a new way. It was just ice cream, but it felt like redemption. The laughter that echoed soon after made every difficult moment of the last few months worth it. Once home, Malik dropped his shoes at the entrance and ran towards his room with the energy of someone who had found a piece of joy again. He shouted from the door that he needed to reorganize his mother's books, as if that were an important and unpostponable mission. Elijah smiled to himself and walked into the living room, feeling the tiredness of the day weighing on his body, but something different in his heart. On the table, the hardcover notebook was open, as if waiting for him, the same smooth handwriting, the same scribbles in the corners of the pages. He ran his fingers along the edge of the paper, with the delicacy of someone holding something that cannot be replaced. It was strange how that object concentrated so much silence, but at the same time, so much presence. Elijah sat up slowly and pulled the notebook closer without realizing that he was doing it with the same attention as someone holding a life. As he read again the passages he already knew, a folded note slipped from between the pages and fell to the floor. He didn't remember seeing it before. When he opened it, he found only one line written by hand, with firm and careful letters. "You're doing well." The sentence was short, but it stayed there, stuck in the air, as if it had been written for that exact moment. Elijah pressed the paper between his fingers and let his head fall back for a moment. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. There was no manual for what lay ahead, but there was love. And that, he was beginning to understand, was all that really mattered. In that memory-filled silence, a new chapter was beginning, a chapter in which he was no longer alone. Another day, as Elijah was organizing some of Yara's unopened boxes, something discreetly slipped away from him and slid to the floor. He bent down with curious care. It was an old photograph, yellowed around the edges, with small creases in the corners. In the image, he and Yara, still very young, were squeezed inside a photo booth. Both smiled with the lightness of someone who believed the world could stop there. Their faces were glued together, their eyes lit up, their arms were intertwined in a hug that seemed to have no end. The photo exuded a carefree happiness, the kind that only exists before experiencing the real pain of life. Elijah didn't remember keeping that image, but looking at it now, a flood of memories flooded his mind, memories of a life that almost existed. In the lower corner of the image, with the same cursive writing that filled the notebook, there was a sentence written in blue pen, already a little erased by time and the touch of hands that at some point held it tightly. It was a simple sentence, just 3 words, but they went through Elijah like a silent arrow. "You did it right." There was no more context, there were no explanations, but those words contained more than any speech. They were a whisper from the past, a belated blessing, a kind of forgiveness that didn't need to be asked. He stood there still, with the image between his fingers, trying to absorb everything that memory could still offer him. It was as if Yara had left another hidden message, knowing that one day he would find it. Elijah held the photo to his chest and closed his eyes for a moment. The silence in the room was no longer heavy. For the first time in a long time, he was able to take a deep breath without feeling like something was squeezing him inside. The pain was still there, but it didn't take over everything. There was room for relief. There was room for longing, for love, and for the peace that only comes when you accept what was and what can still be. When he opened his eyes, he heard Malik's voice in the hallway, asking if they could order pizza for dinner. Elijah smiled, stood up, and answered yes, with the certainty that from then on, he would no longer run away from the life he built. A life that smelled of old paper, a boy's voice, and the memory of a woman who, despite being absent, was still present in everything. And that was what mattered. On a cold and rainy night, Malik appeared in the living room with the blanket under his arm and 2 bags of popcorn in his hand. His expression was determined, almost serious, and he simply said that he had chosen a film and wanted his father to watch it with him. Elijah smiled and accepted without question. They sat side by side on the sofa. The television illuminated the dark room, but what filled the space was something stronger. Elijah realized that he no longer needed to measure words or gestures. His son was there, by his side, of his own free will. During the session, Malik commented on parts of the plot, laughed out loud during exaggerated scenes, and at one point laid his head on his father's shoulder. Elijah didn't move. He just stood there, feeling the light weight of that gesture and thinking about everything they lost, but also about what they could still build. Days later, they returned to the cemetery. Elijah didn't need to suggest it. It was Malik who mentioned that he wanted to visit his mother's grave again. There was no drama in the proposal, no repressed tears, just a silent desire to be close to her. They arrived with new flowers, different from the previous ones. Malik chose daisies because he said they looked happy. They walked between the tombs in silence, side by side, without rushing. In front of the tombstone, the boy gently adjusted the branches and whispered something that Elijah couldn't hear. He stood still, watching his son say goodbye with the respect and love of someone who understood that even when he was absent, His mother would continue to be present in everything he was. Elijah placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, and this time, he felt that he wasn't just a visitor in that story. When they turned away from the tomb and began walking back to the car, the sky was clear and the wind was light. They didn't say anything for a few minutes, but the absence of words wasn't bothersome. It was natural. In silence, they continued forward. Elijah knew that the marks of the past would always be there, but now they were no longer open wounds. They were scars that told where they came from. He looked at Malik, who walked with his shoulders straight and his gaze steady. There was pain there, but there was also strength. That boy was part of him, not just in blood but in life. And now together they were finally ready to start over, not as a father and son who met too late, but as a new family that chose, day after day, to continue. Today's story has come to an end, and if you stayed this far, it's because it touched you in some way. Stories like this remind us that bonds can be rebuilt even after so long. Now before you leave, take the opportunity to like the channel and don't miss the next stories that bring real emotions and deep lessons. In a moment, a video recommended especially for you will appear on the screen, with another engaging and inspiring story, and soon after, a collection with more videos like this, made for those who want to continue being moved by stories that remain in their memories. We'll see you in the next video. Until then.